This Zero Now program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
First, we have Dr. Kevin Everly, the former Chief Operating Officer of Buffalo Public Schools. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Ara. I really appreciate being on here. It's a great opportunity to hear everybody's solutions out here for safety.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. And John Bullwinkle, also welcome to the program. If you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about your background and your connection to the topic, John. We'd appreciate that.
So my background, I was formerly trained as a forensic psychologist, worked with kids and stuff like that in behavioral health, then became a Secret Service agent and worked my entire career in intel or protective intelligence. I was part of the National Threat Assessment Center, did quite a bit of presenting for them, and continue to be into the protective intelligence aspect of this topic.
Awesome. Looking forward to tapping into that experience. And Brian Katz, welcome, formerly from Broward County Public Schools. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Art.
You know, what's interesting here, I'm going to push the poll. We got some smart Alex in the group here. There was an extra choice in here, so let's take a look at the results here. So it looks like about 45% of the participants do have a program. About 13% of school-related folks don't. We have some non-school members and some choice 4, whatever that is. I don't know how that was put into the program. But Kevin, let's start with you. So are you surprised by this? I mean, do most schools have a formalized behavioral threat assessment team?
I think nationally, I really wouldn't know nationally. I know in New York, I've been a chief operating officer from Buffalo and a principal for almost 30 years, or administrator for 30 years. And I would say that's up in the air. I think some of that is skewed. Depending on who are the viewers today, I think there are some good plans out there. I know New York State has a comprehensive plan where it's mandated that you actually put a plan in place, but the implementation of that plan is a whole other story as far as putting it down on paper and actually producing a great product for safety within the schools across the state. That's here nor there. I think we need to really dig deep into that as far as what's really working, what's not working.
And what would you say, John, as far as, you know, the most foundational aspects of prevention? Is it tied with at-risk behaviors from student, or are there some other aspects that are most foundational when it comes to prevention?
And again, as a sort of retired representative of the Secret Service, I think they did some really early work with recognizing concerning behaviors and providing some specific blueprints on how to kind of go about developing a preventive program. Secret Service has a great way to do it because we're sort of mandated to do it. If a threat comes in or if we're concerned about something, we have to respond. We have a very specific way that we go about that. I think implementing those things in schools is the way to go. As far as indicators of behavioral stuff, I did a lot of surveillance, protective surveillance, and being aware of the norm in schools, I think is really important, because then you can recognize changes in behavior or concerning behavior that may indicate something more. And I think those need to be acted upon. I think that's one of the biggest things that we recognized as a means of recognizing some type of concerning behavior or some type of crisis. And it may not be an attack, maybe suicide, or maybe some other crisis situation that we need to follow up on.
And Brian, at Broward County Public Schools, I mean, what type of apparatus or infrastructure did you have to field and handle and identify potential at-risk behaviors?
I think Broward is a great example of an organization that had started very early in the behavioral threat assessment process. It existed for a number of years, but I think had some of the similar challenges that we see at other districts and that Kevin mentioned earlier, which is it's all about implementation, right? And the people who are at the end of that process as to whether it's going to be effective and what that process looks like. One of the significant learnings for the district was about moving off of paper systems, which a lot of districts still using paper for behavioral threat assessments, which ultimately meant a file that had to follow a student as they matriculated through education, right? And so at the end of the day, having something that ultimately, again, is not intended to label or intended to, put kids into a negative light or anything along those lines, but instead is really focused on matching up student with needed service, right? We talk a lot about at-risk students, but really it's students who have needs and most students have a need of some sort, particularly from a psychological perspective and support perspective. And it's about how do you marry those two things up between needs and the specific student who needs it and be able to monitor those well.
If I can jump in with that, exactly what Brian is saying, and as a principal for so many years, especially in an urban setting, I've been fortunate to be around some excellent administrators as a team, and we made it an effort to really talk about conscious awareness and actually teaching students and ones to really be aware of what is going on. The traumatic events that go on, especially in the urban settings, on a nightly basis, and a lot of things are going on. A lot of people, I call it passive acceptance, that well, this is just the news, just happens to go, day to day. And we literally lived it each morning. Something that happened the night before, it could have been shootings, it could have been anything. We were absolutely consciously aware what was going on out on the street, and actually brought it into the awareness for the teachers and the administrators to actually take it to the hallways to really see what the fabric of the tone of the school is that next morning. It was really critical for those behavioral indicators to really be up on top of it.
John.
Yeah, I think to build on that a little bit, I think we talk about within terrorism and things like that, see something, say something. It's really important that we actually do something. A lot of people recognize some situation, and it's almost sometimes easier not to have to address it and see what happens with it rather than actually going out and addressing it. I think that's something, like we're saying, like implementing those programs is paramount to being successful in those programs.
Well, and go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to add on to that, and separating the behavioral from the criminal, right? Because I think there's a lot of overlap these days as it relates to, there's a rush, particularly from administrators, to refer everything to law enforcement. But there's one thing to partner with law enforcement, get law enforcement perspective, have them involved in the process from very early on. And it's another thing to kind of absolve yourself and wash your hands of it and just turn it over to law enforcement, which is not really what most of these kids need.
Yeah. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that more later, but I think it's also important to recognize that some of that criminality may be indicative of some kind of behavior or some kind of crisis that we also need to respond to. And again, working with law enforcement on that, again, same thing, very, very important to have that kind of interaction.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting. We always, in these programs, and in the Zero Now community, we talk about prevention. And the first aspect of prevention is preventing an event from happening, right? Preventing someone from causing harm to themselves or causing harm to others. And there are so many factors that go into that. And you mentioned something earlier, John, about, see something, say something, see something, do something. Obviously in the most recent Secret Service report from NTAC, talked about leakage and about most folks that have actually taken action have told somebody, or there was information that led up to that case. You mind just talking a little bit about what leakage is, what does that actually mean, and how prevalent is that in acts of violence specifically?
And again, you're talking specifically about the bystander study, and I left a link, should be part of the program, to access all of that documentation that the Secret Service provides. But normally, what we've seen in the past, and again, I'm not with NTAC anymore, but what they have seen in the past is that kids let somebody else know. Either they let another student know, or they present specific behaviors that are indicative of some kind of violence. Looking up violent things or violent rhetoric or guns or weapons or how to make bombs, things like that. Or they talk about the Columbine incident, or they do things like that. I like to refer to it as almost like a cry for help. I mean, and looking for things. Kids will let you know when they need help, and when they don't get help is when they end up acting out. And again, that could be criminal behavior. I always tell people it's not just homicide, but it's also suicide. I always think that that's kind of the same, opposite sides of the same coin. And either one of those are things we need to respond to. And either one of those things are normally something that kids talk about. They tell other people. That leakage, that bystander effect is letting some of that intel out, letting people know that something is going to happen, or that they want to do something.
Right. It's a cry for help. I mean, that's really at the end of the day. And Kevin, I know we've discussed this, many times in the past. So, I mean, what are some indicators that schools should be looking for that might indicate some sort of potential risk?
Well, that's the piece I was speaking to earlier, and I know, again, all through the years, especially as a principal, you can see indicators that just a simple student walking down the hallway upset. I mean, for years, there were a lot of people thinking, hey, that's not my business. You know, it might be a teacher administrator saying, they might have a fight with a boyfriend or something like that, and not really being aware of it. There'd be very few times. As a matter of fact, I can't remember in one time that I would not stop a student to actually just inquire, like, hey, is everything okay? What's going on? And I think that element right there, bringing that personal part, building up trust with students and teachers, building those relationships on a daily basis are all critical to the behavior piece and, you know, trying to address those indicators. So, you know, again, the traumatic events, as I said earlier, the traumatic events from night to night. And as John was saying, friends definitely will approach administrators and teachers if they build trust up with them. There's no question about it. And there is a cry for help. And there's a lot of those indicators out there that we can actually assist along the way with all of this. And it's actually worked in many ways. And we're going to go into it deeper when we start talking about the trauma-informed care, you know, trauma-informed indicators and restorative practices and all the things that are going on now. Their schools are really coming to the forefront. But as I talked to my own colleague, very good friend, Dr. Marquecho, I mean, we talk about it all the time. I go, where's the professional development in this? You know, we have a lot of things that happen. We do a lot of seminars, we do a lot of different things, but who's teaching the teachers? Who's teaching the administrators? Who's actually doing this where this is a daily awareness where we can actually have this at the forefront of every day? It's not just reading, writing, arithmetic anymore. It literally is about the whole entire culture and fabric of the school, what we have to do to keep people safe.
So Brian, I mean, so how does a school adopt such a culture where like I think Kevin just mentioned, you know, I mean, the typical MO is, it's none of my business, you know, I need to stay out of it. I mean, what can a student or a parent or someone do if they do see something that is of concern at a school district?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's larger than obviously, you know, this kind of focuses more on the violence, right, and acts of violence and the pathway to violence. But I think that what we really need to think about is if there is open communication in general, right? And then it is about how do you give people the opportunity to communicate, right? And so what we have found to be very successful in districts is making sure that there are a lot of avenues for somebody to be able to report, right? Some people are comfortable coming forward and giving their name. Some people are more comfortable with anonymous reporting. Some people want a text option these days. They want an email option. They want a telephone number that they can call and leave a message, right? The more options you give people, the more likely they are to take advantage of those options. And the more narrow you are, where you say the only way for you to get this apart is for you know, third grade student to go talk to principal of school, well, you're creating barriers and obstacles to their ability to report, right? So the more open you keep that communication, and I think just advocating for open communication and showing that you reward that behavior, right? And that you are recognizing students who are making observations that are not necessarily violence related, right? Reporting that gates are unlocked that shouldn't be unlocked, or that there's a slip and fall hazard somewhere in the school. There's all of these opportunities where you can reward and say, when students come forward and raise safety concerns or security concerns, that the community welcomes that and that it doesn't become a, you know, we're looking for snitches or we're looking for people who are trying to rat people out and put a negative slant on it.
And that's a cultural factor. I mean, yeah, nobody wants to be a snitch. John, what are your thoughts? Sorry.
Yeah, I agree. I think building confidence in the administrative system that not only will they listen to your concerns, that they'll actually react to them and they'll react appropriately. Again, not much like you said, like Brian said, they like letting somebody know that a door is open or something like that isn't met with, that's not none of your business. Don't bother us with it. It's being receptive and being able to react to those things is part of that culture. It's part of building that trust between students and parents and schools and the police. It's a very community oriented thing. There needs to be a cooperative effort to get this kind of stuff done.
And if I can just add one more thing, I think Kevin may have mentioned earlier the sort of notion of kids in crisis, right? We have kids with food insecurity, shelter insecurity, all of those elements. And I was reading the other day sort of the number of graduation things this year where people were mentioning they were the freshman year of COVID, right? And so again, these things, even years later, are sticking with these kids, and providing those services and providing those supports is really what's critical on the other side, again, to try to hopefully prevent or hit something off that might be bubbling up.
I want to mention Dr. Gabrielle Marquetra again. She's going to be on next month, I believe, on your panel talking about caring. This is critical elements that we're talking about here as far as building that fabric and culture of schools. Her research on caring, as far as it's off the charts, as far as dealing with the caring teacher and the caring, mutual. Again, building relationships between the students to students, students to teachers, teachers to administrators. It's the same thing with administrators to teachers. If you do not have that fabric of a school that everybody's working together and they're all empowered to be part of the solution, then it's all fragmented. Everything is fragmented in a school if you do not have that empowerment. And that's what you need to do. You build an empowering staff and student body to understand that you're all part of the holistic plan of keeping everybody safe, including themselves. Really critical.
Exactly, John.
And I think building that culture of safety, again, it's not just for, incidences of violence. It's safety provides an atmosphere, an environment where kids can learn. I mean, and I think it benefits us across the board, particularly in education. Also want to mention when Suzanne Payne kind of developed Safe to Tell early on after Columbine, the top 6 things on there were not attacks or homicide. There were other things like kids getting in fights, kids doing drugs, kids having issues, again, with food or with things like that or other issues. There was that system of notification provides a lot of other avenues for a lot of other things, not just violence, not just homicide, not just suicide, but again, it assists with that culture and that area of awareness.
And that's so important. And how much does culture cost? Right. It's free. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, this is something that can be done now, and it is something that has substantial preventative factors. And Kevin, you're talking about the caring program. We one of our Zero Now advisors, Dr. Scott Geller from Virginia Tech, created this program, Actively Caring for People. And it's all about positive reinforcement. And those of you that have been on this program before have heard he flipped see something, say something into something positive. When you see something positive, say something like, "Oh man, Kevin, that was so nice what you just did. Thanks for doing that," or we appreciate the fact that you helped so and so. But it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, we implemented some different things, just simple things like a random acts of kindness, of actually having students actually thinking about what does that actually mean. I mean, to actually have a mindfulness type setting where you start getting away from the old retribution or suspensions, and let's just suspend everybody for their behaviors and everything. And the things that we did in the last few years in Buffalo, my last few years, I went from COO back to the principalship to actually take care of a school for a few years, and it's actually turned into a fabulous East Side school with continuing on with those mindfulness elements, the actual caring elements within the school, and they're really proud of what they're doing on the East Side of Buffalo with that school. And it really comes down to that. Again, it's the caring, the kindness, and doing something else than just throwing people out of school. I mean, the whole idea of you get in trouble and let's just exclude them just hasn't worked in 50 years. I mean, let's face it, we have a 120-year-old system that really is sort of archaic in many ways, still having rows of desks and all the, the teacher in front of the classroom. They're starting to change that now. You're starting to look into more settings, different classroom settings, different approaches for methodologies for instruction. But all of it all comes down to, again, as John and Brian are alluding to, if kids don't feel safe, teachers don't feel safe, and the anxiety and depression and fear is at a heightened level, it's going to be very difficult to have them actually get to the end of the road of learning. And that's where the safety has to be front row, front and center.
Yeah, John, absolutely, Kevin.
And just to build on that, I think that there's a lot of things that it's not something we can do right now. This is something we kind of need to focus on in pre-K and kindergarten and things like that. Building students that are more resilient, that have that mindfulness kind of thing, that do a lot of other problem solving. Emotional intelligence is an enormous thing. Understanding what you bring to the table, what other kids are going through, those are all things that they're easily implemented. And again, like you said, building that culture is free. The programs may cost something to get into them or something like that, but there's people doing a lot of great work. Yale has a great emotional intelligence program that builds on a program called Ruler. There's a lot of school systems out there that are implementing things that recognize emotional intelligence or resilience, and having that peer kind of counseling thing where you go work together with other students and you empower the students to help other students. And again, when you recognize concerning behaviors, a lot of that comes from other students. You find out about it from students first. And somebody spoke about it earlier. UPenn is doing a lot of work with positive psychology, not just looking for those problems, but looking for the positives and kind of, putting more value on those as well.
It's a culture, and John, to your point, I was out in Los Angeles visiting family a few months ago. My niece, I think she's in 5th grade, but we're talking through this path to safer schools and the prevent harm side of things. And we spent a good 90 minutes talking about what are some ways that students can help prevent harm by identifying other students that may be at risk, might be sitting alone at the cafeteria, or might be targeted. Are there specific programs? This is for either one of you. Are there specific programs that revolve around student activity and taking an active role in involvement and intervention? Is that? I'm sure that there is some sort of program, John.
And again, I would defer to Kevin on this, but there are programs. Step Up was an early program where if a kid recognizes another kid in some kind of crisis, they step up, they say hello, they welcome those kids. A lot of schools have implemented red benches where, it's someplace where a kid can sit and be invited to play games or something like that. It's actively going out, trying to find kids and trying to get them part of the environment.
Yeah, and I have to add to that. I mean, that's the part where we start delving into the technological side of this conversation now, because that's the piece that I've been around for the last couple of years. I mean, unfortunately, I've been with the company with weapons detection with Evolve. It's a phenomenal company that has invented something for the safety of schools, and they've really done a remarkable job. But there are a lot of other companies, TapApp, Centegix. I mean, all these different pieces out there. There are things in place to actually gaggle. All these different elements are out there that administrators, as school boards and superintendents, they're searching for different solutions to help with this multi-layered approach to safety. So the programs within it, again, still comes back to the human element. No matter what the technology is, no matter what the app is, no matter what all the different things we can do, as Brian's alluding to, as far as the police itself, where do we cross over between law enforcement and actual nurturing of the actual students and teachers and keeping everybody safe? You have to bring it all together. And that's the tough thing I'm having with some of the cynicism that's going on in the world right now, where you're starting to see some of the naysayers, trying to, put a theater type thing as, oh, it's all theater, you don't need any of this stuff. And as a ground level principle, I'm saying there's no theater to any of this stuff to add to all these elements to keep the kids safe and live a day in the world of a principal or a teacher. People will know that, instead of actually putting the stuff out there that's just all theater.
Well, go ahead, Brian, please.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and Kevin alluded to it a little bit, but at the end of all of that are people, right? And so having the accountability of being able to make sure that if you have set an expectation at your school, at your district, how are you tracking those expectations? Because at the end of the day, I think there is a tendency from districts to think that they can just plug something in and kind of forget about it, or that, hey, this sounds like a good idea in principle, but then they don't think about how much staff will it take for me to manage that? How much money for recurring costs, all of those other items as part of it. And then when that stuff disappears, you're still left with people. And the people are the ones, as we were talking about before, who are really going to be your best, your best sources back to being able to prevent some of these issues. So at the end of the day, really having that accountability piece built into it, which a lot of schools and a lot of districts just don't have at this point. And so it's something that we spend a lot of time advocating for, which is, look, you've got policies, you've got procedures, you have expectations, but what are you doing to make sure people are actually following your expectations, right? And that you have to have some of that stuff in place. Otherwise, for those who are district personnel who are out there, you're really actually just creating liability, because there is an expectation you've now said codified it in policy or in law that you must do something. And then the answer is, but we weren't tracking to see whether people were doing it or not, right? And so again, I think this is an opportunity for multidiscipline team approaches, right? Everybody needs to be involved. It isn't just that, wait, we have one security person on a campus, that person's responsible for security, right? It has to be a team environment where everybody is involved in that process, because the issues that we're talking about, particularly related to kids up till now, as was mentioned earlier, affect our staff members. right? Our security staff members are often low-paid individuals at the school level who have their own insecurities as it relates to financial and health and all of those other aspects, right? We need to be a community at the individual school to try to help from a safety and security perspective.
Absolutely. John.
So I think, again, from the Secret Service standpoint, I think there's a lot of aspects that that go into that safety program. Another Secret Service agent, you've dealt with him before, Mike Matrenga, over at M6 Global. It is a holistic thing. There's a lot of other stuff going on. We need those notification systems. We need those secure programs, glass and locks and metal detectors. But ultimately, you need people on the ground looking at that preventative aspect. And again, I also defer back to students in the community or the school. They're the people that are experts on their school. They're going to notice those changes. There has to be kind of a coordinated effort between that security and between the mental health and between teachers and what's going on in your school in order to find that stuff out. And again, building that holistic program is, again, that's how this prevention kind of system works. I don't want to have to respond to a shooting. I want to try and prevent that before it happens, or know that a kid can come to an adult. One of the big things the Secret Service found, that one relationship with an adult, a person in authority, was stopped a lot of these violent acts. Somebody was able to go to somebody that they trusted and have a conversation that they were able to get help with. So again, building on all of those things, you can't just have one without the other. You need to have those systems in place, and you need to have the behavioral aspect as well.
Absolutely.
And it's amazing, John. You're so on, both you and Brian. When I think about this being an administrator all these years, I mean, it's over 3 decades, and before that, I didn't even mention it, because those who know me know I was a police officer starting out of college. So over the 40 years, I have an eclectic way of looking at law enforcement and teaching, educating, counseling. It really is amazing to me when you really think about our world right now, based on safety and prevention, especially in schools. But actually, it's everywhere now in houses, everything, because it's mandated by law that we have to have smoke detectors, we have to have fire alarms, we have to have sprinkler systems in public venues. And that's been around for 50, 60, 70 years. And when you really look at the actual rate of tragedy because of fires within schools, it's minuscule compared to the actual possibilities of shootings and different things that are gun related or weapons related to schools, and there's nothing mandated. So it's really interesting where, as Johnny was saying, that all those layers have to be in there. And I advocate for anything and everyone that wants to use any of those layers of technology, but the human element has to be parallel with it as the multi-layer of that. But if you really start looking at it, I mean, look at all the stuff of the human element of a fire drills. New York State, 8 fire drills, 4 active shooters. You know, those are drills that these kids are doing it from kindergarten all the way through pre-K, all the way to 12th grade. They're going to see that. But it's still, the fire alarm piece has been in place for many, many years, and we aren't really coming up to the plate when it comes to all the other safety issues that have really transpired in the last 2 decades, that we need to really bring that to the lobbyist level and take it, you know, and that's a political thing now we have to start looking at, get that up to the awareness of where we bring all this in, like Omni Alert or Evolve or anything. It doesn't matter, you know, whatever those layers are, and train the human beings on with it. John, you're right on.
Yeah, I agree. Just to build on that, I think I'm a behavioral guy. My background's in psychology. I've done protective intelligence has been my role. But any of those technological things, those alert systems that get the right people responding to these incidences, any technology that recognize weapons and stuff like that, seconds save lives in these incidences. I think some of the intact studies have shown that most of these incidences are over within minutes. Unless there's a hostage situation or something like that, these incidents are over in less than 5 minutes. So those moments, those seconds save lives. So getting that technology out there, like fire alarms, that's a mass notification system that gets the right people moving, gets the right people moving out of the area. Those things, again, that's part of the whole preventative process.
Well, and that's you guys are making great points here, and I always make the point, you know, with Zero Now, obviously, you know, we're big fans of technology, but technology are tools, right? Tools of the trade for those that know how to use that. So whether you're a safety director or a school psychologist or a principal, I mean, these are all they're tools that in the right hands can be appropriately and effectively applied. All too often, though, you have school districts, and one of you mentioned this, like we just need to do something. You have a superintendent that just, okay, we'll buy this technology, we'll buy this, and this will make our school safe. unless you really know how to use it, and unless it fits into a broader plan with your other assets, with your other human assets, but also technology assets, it's not going to be nearly as effective as in the right hands of the right person. What do you think, John?
I agree. It's incredibly easy to sign a check and get technology or get defensive mechanisms in place. It's difficult to set up a preventative system or a behavioral health system or a threat assessment system. I tell people all the time, it's simple, but it's not easy. I mean, getting involved with kids and their lives in crisis and things like that is not easy. It's far easier just to put up a magnetometer and say, oh, guns are never going to get in my school. But again, as somebody alluded to earlier, now you're liable for a gun that does get into your school. And we know kids, they're smarter than we are, 9 times out of 10. They'll be able to do things that we can't do. They'll get weapons in. They'll figure out a way to get drugs into the building, things like that. We have to be aware of those things. And again, that preventative aspect, building that resiliency, building that mindfulness early on helps to avoid some of that stuff down the road. So again, from a preventative standpoint, I'm always going to lean into the behavioral side, but I can't deny the importance of the other tech side.
Absolutely. Brian.
Yeah, and I would add to that 2 things. One, which is, the importance of just risk assessment in general, right? And so knowing what your actual risks in your community are, what your risks are for your specific site, the ways that students might be harmed, what are the most likely, right? And it's about trying to figure out how do you put solutions in place that will address those risks, right? It may be in some locations, those are traffic related risks in front of a school because you've got, a high speed thoroughfare or whatever that goes right past your school. Or the people come racing through or any number of things that might need solutions. It's not just about weapons, right? And we also know that a significant, particularly on the shooting side of incidents, happen after school, happen outside of where you might have metal detectors in the first place, right? And so at the end of the day, it's about, as we've heard the others say, having a comprehensive approach that says, I understand what our risks are. I recognize I can't solve every problem. I understand I can't even address every problem, but I can at least prioritize how I'm spending my money, how I'm spending my staff time, how you're spending your training, right? You've got a limited amount of time. I know Kevin will agree with this, that, principals and staff members only have so many hours in a year for you to train them on anything. So what are you going to spend that time on, right? If you only have a few minutes from them, what do you hope to get out of them? And for us, it's really focusing on situational awareness. It's focusing on, as we heard everybody say before, spotting things that are outside the norm, right? Because if you spend your time trying to get them to do A, B, C, D, and E in order, when they're called upon to do that 9 months later, the likelihood that they're going to remember that is actually very low.
That is so well stated. That is probably the biggest thing, talking about professional development, of the amount of money and the grant money that's used for professional development. And in schools, it's famous for methodologies and all the different things as far as learning and teaching. But when it comes to the safety realm and the actual area of building that fabric within that school of how do you keep that safe, you're absolutely right, Brian. I mean, it has to be sort of like building the plane while you're, flying the plane while you're building it. It's like it's a daily reoccurrence that you have to have it where it's just constant. And it's like osmosis. It's just changing. It's like Jello. It's moving all the time. And as an administrator, boy, you said it so well. As far as the reality of it is, the money being spent for a lot of the things and all the hardware and all the different things is great, but if you don't have the professional development behind it and then ongoing mindset, it's very difficult, really difficult to get anything started or continue.
Yeah, and I would agree that the professional development is important, and as well, like you were saying, as Brian was saying, the White House is one of the safest places in the world, despite what people might think. But the president leaves that house, and we have to do stuff in the field. We have to continue to provide those safe areas for him to go. It's the same thing with students. We can have all the processes within the school system, 100 yards out into the parking lot, recognize things like that. But what do we do when they go to prom? What do we do when they go to away football games, basketball games, things like that? That preventative aspect of it, we see that concerning behavior early on, and we're able to stop it before it becomes an issue. We can only depend on that technology stuff so far. Other schools may not have the same thing that our school has or that your school has. So again, prevention, I'm always going to defer back to prevention whenever I can. I try to avoid a fight if I can. I try to avoid defending an attack if we can. If I can stop a kid from killing themselves or doing something dangerous prior to that happening, it's gonna save not just that kid, but a lot of other kids as well. Being aware of those crisis situations before you have to depend on technology or defensive postures is always going to work better.
Exactly, John. And that is part of a multi-layered approach in that it's not a physical security. Before you even get to physical security, we're talking about a cultural layer, right? We're talking about a community layer. We're talking about behavioral intervention, identifying those risk factors. That's before we even get to physical security. But then on the physical security side, and Kevin mentioned, you have early threat detection using, artificial intelligence, automation, having technology that works together. Because if you have disparate systems, it's useless unless it's working together. You can automate response within a matter of seconds. So, like I mentioned, it's about preventing an event. But if we fail to prevent an event, can we prevent harm through early threat detection, physical threat detection, automation, using your technology? But that stuff needs to be in the hands of the right person that knows how to utilize that. We have,
and it's an opportunity. All right, there's an opportunity, all right, for people with all of this automation out there. I behoove anyone on the panel, or anybody that's listening today, or friends that you want to tell. There is a lot of technology out there for people to actually see it firsthand, and it doesn't matter what the technology is. I mean, people need to hear this stuff because a lot of people have different opinions without really even knowing what those layers are, because they're not in schools. They might have been in schools, but they really, are given opinions that are actually hurting the actual business itself of safety. And again, going back to it's all about prevention. This is not anything else, but how are we preventing the events to start in the first place? So I definitely encourage people to actually look and see, because I guarantee there's local schools and buildings. You can see it everywhere.
John.
And I agree with you, Ari, that we have to have that stuff in place to stop that threat if it happens. But back to the preventive kind of thing, we talk about the pathways to violence. All this stuff starts with a grievance and it works its way into the school. If it's not addressed early on in that pathway, if it's not stopped at some point in there, we absolutely have to have something in place to defend it, because inevitably we can't stop every single attack. Even from the Secret Service standpoint, we do our best to prevent that stuff, but we're always going to have people in the right places to do the right job when the need arises.
Mr. Katz.
No, and I would just add to that, from John and I, from both of our backgrounds, we tried to make hard targets, right? And the goal was that you wanted people to go elsewhere and to look at you as a hard target and not come after your environment, right? But when we talk about schools, it's so different because it's a community-related issue. If you push that issue down the street, which again, I think some technologies do. They say, great, it won't happen at the school, but it'll happen at the 7-Eleven on the corner. You're not solving the issue because it's still, going to happen. But I think the things that we were talking about when you get community involvement, both the internal community of the school itself, your district, sort of that whole environment, but again, the community engagement outside your external community, so that they also know how to bring something to the attention of the school if they see it bubbling up, right? How many fights, Kevin, did you have in your school that were the beef that started last night because of, the brother and sister having a fight with somebody, right? And so those things will follow kids into schools, and thinking of the school as this kind of bubble that things are not going to come into it is unrealistic, right? And John gave the example of the White House, right? Even as safe as the White House is, there are penetrations and people get over fences and people get through. The expectation that ultimately at a school level where you have far less funding, far less staffing, far less training, far less whatever, that it's going to be a higher standard is just unrealistic. So we have to focus on both those prevention aspects, but then obviously then we have to focus on response. We have to focus on recovery as well.
Brian, it's interesting. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
I agree with you, Brian. Like when we talk about hardening targets, and I know of an incident when I was in NTAC, we were collecting data and things like that. A student went to a school and the school was too difficult to do an attack at. So we went to the local library. Again, they will look for softer targets. We've seen it in the initial case study the Secret Service did in the 90s. That was one of the things we found. They can't get to the president. They'll go to a candidate. They'll go to a congressman. They'll go to a representative. So again, that preventative thing kind of addresses that prior to it becoming an attack.
Exactly.
Go ahead, Ken, sorry.
I was just going to add on to what Brian was saying from the school perspective, and in one of the comments right now, a good colleague, another principal, a retired principal in Buffalo, Rafael Mercado, and a light of it. But when we were in the city, we knew when there was a fight the next morning, when the girls were taking their earrings off and taking all their jewelry off, there's going to be something going down the hallway. You could feel the tone before you even got started. So on a lighter note, it was that conscious awareness of everybody knowing something happened and being aware what happened the night before. Just as John's alluding to, you just don't go get in the cars and all the Tahoes and send the president down the road. I mean, there's planning on top of planning of the inner perimeter and the outer perimeter and all the different things just to get him down the road, get him over to the airport. So it's the same thing with us. I mean, and a lot of times, unfortunately, in schools, that layer is missed because it's, again, that passive acceptance. You just basically, it's another day, nothing happened last night, so let's just happen, and all chaos, takes off when you're not really aware of what's happening. So it really is that awareness that's critical.
And
Ryan.
and I know particularly in Broward, again, most of our schools were 50, 60, 80 years old. They were not designed in a time where we were building them to be safe and secure environments. They were designed to be open environments. Parents could walk right up to the classroom and drop their kid off, right, without having to check in, without having any of those. So once somebody says, now you need to try to harden that location and, put a single gate around the entire thing and think that it solves the problem, right? So at the end of the day, again, it's about how do you build that positive relationship, I believe, also with the community. So they're helping you watch the school, right? If somebody is misbehaving on school campus after hours, or they see people loitering, that the community has a stake in that school and will tell somebody about it so that it doesn't just happen, right? We don't come in and just find the vandalism the next day and that they were in the school for, the entire evening and nobody did anything about it, right?
Yep, absolutely. John.
It's cliche, but it takes a village, and the service talks about consulting those other community people. Like, if you have a threat, you have to go to the other people. Maybe it's that person's job. Maybe it's obviously their parents, but going to the other people in the school system, the coaches. One of the incidents we talked about was a bus driver that noticed a kid limping because he had a gun in his, tucked into his leg. Going to all those other people and involving them in this process is also important as well. And again, we talked a little bit about involving the police and knowing where the police are appropriate to be, whether it's an education thing or whether it's a violence thing. It goes the same way. The schools need to notify the police of an incident, but the same thing if the police are responding to a home where there's a domestic violence thing, they need to let the schools know that, the kids don't have parents today because both parents are in jail. There's an important part of that whole community aspect where everybody is involved. Again, kids are in sports and things like that. How many people value the coach's opinion? He's going to see a change in performance, and that's, again, something we need to involve people with.
And that's the community layer, John. That's the far layer out before we even get to physical security. We just have under 15 minutes left, so we're going to take a few questions from our participants. If you have any questions, please hit the Q&A button and just type in your question. We'll get to it. If we don't answer your question during the live program, like I mentioned, after this, if you go to the Zero Now community, we'll have a Q&A section for this particular program, which we will post the replay of this next Tuesday. We have a question here, so I'm not sure who wants to answer this one here, but do we have data on the schools that have a threat assessment team in a process? Do they have fewer incidents than schools without it? Does that data exist today? Is anyone aware of that? Brian?
I don't think that data exists, because also at the end of the day, remember, you're getting a ton more reporting at that stage, right? So you have a lot of school sites where you aren't gathering any data. Now you're suddenly collecting data. Those things are going to look like a significant increase. So I think what we're seeing in most of the research that's coming out is that we just don't have enough data yet. They haven't existed long enough for us to say 20 years in, this is what we've seen from a change. But I certainly defer to John and Kevin.
Yeah, I think the Secret Service did just do a averted attacks study. So that's out there. But I also, again, and Brian probably agree with me on this, from an intelligence perspective, it's incredibly difficult to talk about stuff that didn't happen. We don't know what prevented a case. I know of a case where a kid was crying. A school resource officer went over and spoke to her. He didn't know until the end of the year that she was crying because she was going to kill herself that day. We don't know about that until after the fact. So it's incredibly difficult. It's even incredibly difficult for the Secret Service to say, we averted that attack that day because of our presence. There's plenty of cases. I know of a Florida case because a person saw people with sunglasses. He thought everybody with sunglasses was a Secret Service agent, so he didn't conduct that attack. Do we have intelligence on that? Not for years, not until years down the road. So it's tough to say that we avoided an attack because we won't know, because the attack didn't happen. So again, that's tough. But I'm sure there's information out there. Again, I always tell people GTS, Google that stuff, go look it up. I mean, there's probably some studies out there that talk a little bit more about that. I think it's also, and I think Kevin will agree, some of that information may be skewed. A lot of schools don't have any attacks. There's never been a crisis at schools. Why do they need a system? Because again, it doesn't look good if your school has a bunch of crises or a bunch of attacks. So some of that information is lost to that as well.
John, you're totally on with that. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to say, we always caution districts, the absence of incident is not safety. So at the end of the day, the sort of notion that you don't have the reporting at this stage, particularly when you're talking about a major event occurring at that location, one is not a predictor of the other. And so at the end of the day, what you often see when you have these tragedies is that's when people start really looking into things and saying, now burn it all down and start from scratch. But if they could go years and years or decades or never have an incident, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily doing things correctly. Sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
I think it's probably one of the most frustrating elements when you look at post analysis of shootings nationally, when because everybody says, oh my goodness, oh, we knew about this, we knew about that, oh, well, we could have done this and done that. Well, not at the time, not real time, because it's just not that way. I mean, as a principal on a daily basis, I mean, we literally collecting data. I don't know how we would have done that on a case-to-case basis of how many students we were dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and actually, quantify that into a spreadsheet to say, oh wow, let's look back like 6 months ago, or as you're saying, referring to someone that possibly was thinking about suicide 6 months before. It's just it's a very, very difficult piece. And the one element that was stated, a lot of people don't want to have their school looked upon as, oh, we have issues. So there's a lot of them that they're not going to record it anyways, because it's no, we have a great school here. So there's a lot of skewed data out there as far as what that school is all about and what's happening in there. Especially look at just the daily bullying. The daily bullying in pre-K through 12 right now is so rampant that there's no possible way to actually quantify that on a daily basis, because kids don't come to everybody and tell them. They keep it in. I mean, but it's a real serious issue across the country right now.
I was just going to add into that, especially when you take cyberbullying into that mix,
oh my God.
Where
Absolutely.
Again, now you're just talking about, again, it's all going on, and until a student brings it forward, nobody even knows it's going on, right?
Right.
Kevin, it's interesting. The whole perception. 15 years ago, we released this. I think at the time it was like the first text to tip system out there. It's like text in, this keyword. If you see something, say something. Stop bully. I think we're positioning as bully buster. The whole idea is balancing the whole psychology thing of like, well, hey, if people are going to report me, I maybe not do something. But the interesting thing is, schools did not want that implemented because there was concern that this will present a perception that this is an unsafe environment. What, do we have a bullying problem? If we have an anti-bullying, or a tipping system in our school, does that mean that we have a problem? Versus being proactive and saying, okay, no, we want to get ahead of this. But that's a very real situation. We don't want to implement things because that will create a perception that this is an unsafe environment. How do you deal with that, Kevin?
I got to add one other caveat to that also. There's another element to this as far as the things that are not actually noted. And this has nothing to do with schools. It has to do with the community. It has to do with real estate. There are a lot of school districts that are actually, sort of in the course of, we have to have more students, and we have to, charter school movement there. How do we get more students and everything? We got to make it like we have, the Yellow Brick Road here. There's a lot of communities that aren't going to say any of this stuff about it because they want people to move into that community to go to that school district. So there's a lot of those things. It's a trickle down effect that realtors are getting involved, mayors are getting involved. There's a lot of people getting involved to say, hey, we have a safe environment here, community wise, to actually talk about this stuff. So that's why, again, going back to the skewed data and all the things that are out there from 15 years ago to now, it's really tough for a lot of politicians and mayors and everybody to say, hey, we have the place where you want to move to, when underlying, when you hear from teachers and administrators and go, oh man, this has been a rough go of it. So it's a tough challenge to really balance that all, what you actually do with it to actually help in the matter.
Right.
And that's, Kevin, I think that's really where third-party risk assessments come in. Like having to bring somebody in from the outside and having them be able to ask everybody questions, be able to do interviews about, oh, so principal's telling me this never happens. You know who will tell you that it's happening? The janitor, the custodian, the facilities person, the security staff. Like, those people will be like, here's the real reality of what's going on. Now, whether they can quantify it, that may be a gap, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest challenges in particularly K-12 safety and security at this point is safety and security by anecdote, not by data, right? And so not taking a data-driven approach to trying to figure out what those risks are and how to address it, right? And so I think the more districts can do, to your point, Kevin, of knowing what the reality is, the more you can address that reality. The more you bury your head in the sand and you try to ignore that those things are happening, you don't get the funding, you don't get the support, you don't get the things that you need to try to address those issues, and they just get exponentially worse over time.
And what's interesting, Brian, along those lines is, I mean, I would say a major shift in higher education when it came to safety, because there's always, the Clery Act has been around since 1990. But after April 16, 2007, things completely changed culturally. So in schools, not only because they had to, they wanted to inform the community. John mentioned mass notifications and all that. That became a real thing after Virginia Tech, because we want to let the community know that, hey, there's an emerging weather situation or a pit bull on campus or whatever it is. They wanted to, and they were praised. The community said, thank you, school, for letting us know about this. Prior to that, it was very much about concealing information. Well, we don't want people to know that there was a pit bull on campus. We don't want people to know that there was a robbery at the bookstore. And so that was a cultural shift that happened almost overnight in higher education. But we're still not there with K through 12. I mean, things are changing with K through 12, but it still is that cultural layer that goes well before physical security that we have to contend with. We have a couple more minutes. I think we have time for one more question. And I think, Kevin, you might probably be best to answer this one, or Brian. So we talk about, the awareness and identifying behavioral issues with at-risk factors with students. Are we teaching students? Is there like an orientation at schools typically that talk about, hey, if you see something, let a teacher know or let the principal know? I mean, how are those things implemented from a student perspective?
Yeah, I think it's sporadic. I again, depending on the leader and depending on the experience of those leaders, is really going to be the bottom line of what that school looks like. The leadership starts between the principal, the administrators, the administrative team, how they build that trust and how they build that network of staff to really, again, have a holistic view, as we were saying earlier, about, Peter Senge was a great writer from 35 years ago, talked about the fifth discipline, saying you have to have that mental model, shared vision, and ultimately a systemic thought process to actually create an organization that's all there. But it has to be all together. And those are the kind of things that you have to really talk about to say, okay, how do you bring it together? And how do you get teachers and administrators together to actually keep the students safe? And it's come a long way. I think there are leaders out there that are actually very aware of it. But I think because the changeover, unfortunately, again, as I said, the school system itself, 120-year-old school system from 1900, basically has been based on agriculture from 120 years ago. And it's like, getting people ready for factories. And that's just not the case anymore. I mean, it's to the point where you need to empower, as I said earlier, you have to empower the teachers, empower the students. And I think more and more are starting to do that. But unfortunately, with the changeover of superintendents and the changeover of principals, you don't have the consistency anymore. So that's the tough part of it right now.
Brian.
The one thing that I would add to that also is, again, the power of student-led safety and security groups, right? And being able to say that, again, I used to say, like, the best way, there were some comments in the chat, like, how do you get principals to do stuff? Best way to get principals to do stuff is have other principals put pressure on them, not administrators that are from the district, right? Same for students. Students policing each other, students being able to raise concerns, students being able to raise things up to district leadership or school leadership about what they are observing and what they're what a student will tell another student, and then they have the ability to bring into you, I think is invaluable. And it's something that there's a lot of grant money that's out there right now that people could take advantage of to try to build those programs, pay the administrative staff or the teachers to be that ahead of that club or help with those organizations. Because again, as John was saying before, that's how we build community, and that's how we sort of change outcomes.
And with that, John, I know we're actually running out of time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on Brian's comment, but also if you have additional thoughts just to share with our participants, just some final words of wisdom from your perspective.
Again, we talked a little bit about building those cultures and building emotional intelligence and things like that. And there are mentor programs out there. There are student leadership programs out there that people are implementing them. When you asked me about doing this thing in prevention, I don't know how many times I went out to do presentations and people would ask, like, where do we get this information? How do we get this information? Where is there a booklet that we can read to figure out this? And again, I pushed the NTAC, the National Threat Assessment Center, as part of the Secret Service. I left a link there. The FBI has BTAC. Dewey Cornell's done a bunch of really good work. There's tons of information out there. And when we talk about new and innovative products, for me, it's go back and look at the initial programs. Look at those threat assessment programs. This stuff was established 20 years ago, post-Columbine, things like that, I guess 30 years ago at this point. But again, go back and look at those things and implement the stuff that's already there. Implement the programs that are already available. Again, prevention, I'm always going to lean towards prevention. From a protective intelligence standpoint, I think it's an incredibly large part of the Secret Service that doesn't get a lot of recognition. But as you said, Ari, you still have to have, those defensive mechanisms in place in case you don't have that prevention. Thank you.
John, just to add one more agency into that mix for people is CISA. Because CISA is putting out a lot of that information right now, the cybersecurity and infrastructure. So ultimately, they're focusing on school safety and REMS, TA, and all of those elements. So again, lots of, as John was talking about, public, free, available resources that people can take advantage of to help.
And on those lines, gentlemen, we're going to link those resources. Well, first of all, some of the resources you have will be in the Zero Now community, but the Path to Safer Schools, we're going to include some additional resources in there to connect administrators with those tools and student-led organizations, that type of stuff. Dr. Eberly, final words of wisdom for our participants.
I'm going to say it. I'm going to reiterate what the other two distinguished guests are saying. It's all about prevention and what we're doing as a collaborative group. That's why I just appreciate you, as far as Zero Now and the efforts of Zero Now and bringing this all together as a collaborative team. And we just have to keep on pushing it, that we have to do this all together. And I think with the resources, with the distinguished backgrounds of everybody you're bringing on here, it's just fabulous to keep everybody aware and keep it forefront that it's all about safety and keeping our kids and teachers safe. So I appreciate you having us on.
No, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, John. Yeah, one of the things we were talking about before this is that, we could spend all day going through this because there's so many different elements, and we are going to go into deep dives in a lot of these elements, like mental health aspects. We didn't get too far into that today, the technology side. There's so many different factors that we need to get into. But this was a the first step forward on that discussion. Want to remind folks to go to the community after this, continue the conversation there. Our next program is Respond to Threats with Confidence, which is Tuesday, August 20th at 2 p.m. Is that right? No, July 16th. It is be prepared. Be prepared. I'm getting way ahead of it. I thought it was already July. We're only in June. But that's coming up next month. Be sure to register for that. And continue this conversation about the path to safer schools. And, we're on this journey together. So we got to take each step one at a time and actually make our schools safe and secure. So thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, John. We will see you all in the community. I think within about 30 minutes, it'll be posted in there. So we'll catch you there. So thanks, guys. Take care.